Just south of Ferndale, in Humboldt County, California, there's a piece of state highway that runs a little over 5 miles and then quits. It starts on Ocean Avenue, in a dairy town with painted Victorian storefronts, crosses the Eel River on an old concrete bridge, and ties into the Inland Freeway. That's the whole road. 5 1/3 miles of asphalt with its own number, State Route 211, and hardly anyone driving it, has a reason to wonder why a stretch that short got a number of its own. It got one because it was meant to be the top of Highway 1. The Pacific Coast Highway, the road that hugs the California shoreline past Big Sur and San Francisco and Point Reyes, and the town of Mendocino, was drawn on the state's books to keep going north. Up through the Sinkyone country, past Shelter Cove, out along the lower Matole River, around Cape Mendocino, and into Ferndale, where that 5-mile stub sat waiting to receive it. State highway planners extended the route on paper back in the 1930s. Crews were expected to follow. They never did. In 1984, California quietly bent the northern end of Highway 1 inland. At a logging site called Rockport, the Coast Highway turns away from the ocean, climbs east through the redwoods, and merges with the Inland Freeway at a wide spot called Leggett. The Ferndale stub got renumbered and left alone. Between those 2 points sits a gap of roughly 100 miles of highway that exists only as lines on a legislative map, and about 80 miles of Pacific coastline with no coastal road on it whatsoever. The longest stretch of undeveloped shoreline left in the lower 48 states. And the state of California put it there by choosing to give up. Now, plenty of coastline is hard to build on. Big Sur is hard to build on, and they built there anyway, blasting benches into cliffs and rebuilding after every winter that takes a section out. So the interesting question isn't really whether this terrain is steep. It's why this particular terrain was the one place where the whole idea got abandoned. Start with the shape of the land. The King Range rises straight out of the surf here, and King Peak, its high point, stands at 4,088 feet. From that summit to saltwater is roughly 3 miles. There's no shelf, no gentle apron of coastal plain, nothing you could lay a roadbed across. And this happens to be one of the wettest places in the state. Weather stations in these mountains commonly log more than 100 inches of rain a year, and in a heavy winter, more than 200 inches has come down on the high ground. Steep rock, enormous rainfall, and a coastline getting hammered by open Pacific swell that has crossed thousands of miles with nothing in its way. That's the version most people repeat, and as far as it goes, it's accurate. It's also only the surface of the thing. Here's what makes this coast different from every other hard piece of California shoreline. The ground under it is moving upward, fast, and it is doing it right now. Along parts of this shore, geologists working from the elevations of ancient beaches have measured average uplift on the order of 4 millimeters a year over the past 70,000 years or so. That sounds like nothing. Run it out, and it's about 13 feet every 1,000 years. This coastline is one of the fastest rising pieces of ground on the Pacific margin of North America, and everything else on this stretch, the failed road, the abandoned light station, the towns that emptied, the beaches themselves, follows from that single fact. So let's walk it. South to north, the way the swell runs, and the way the story assembles itself. The southern end starts on a road that most rental car agreements would frown on. To reach Usal Beach, at the bottom of the Sinkyone country, you leave the coast highway well north of the village of Westport and turn onto a dirt track that climbs and drops for about 6 miles, unpaved, narrow, and closed by mud in a wet winter. On the far side, you come out on a gray beach with a creek running across it and a campground under the alders. And from there, the Lost Coast Trail runs north for roughly 22 miles through Sinkyone Wilderness State Park. Walk that trail and you'll notice something that doesn't fit the word wilderness. There are old apple trees. There are rusted cable spools and lengths of iron rail buried in the grass. At Bear Harbor, a small notch in the cliffs, there are the remains of a landing and traces of a railroad grade. At Needle Rock, a little farther north, there's a ranch house that the park now uses as a visitor center, and around it the ghost of a settlement that had a dairy and a store in the 1920s. This coast was worked hard. Through the 1860s, pack strings carried tannic bark out of these hills down to the water, where it was loaded onto schooners bound for the tanneries of San Francisco. Tannic bark is loaded with tannin, and tannin is what turned cowhide into leather. That trade built the little dog-hole ports strung along this shore, places like Usal, Needle Rock, Bear Harbor, Anderson's Landing, where a ship would anchor in open water and cargo would be run out to it on a cable because there was no harbor to speak of. By the early 1890s, there was a railroad hauling bark down to Bear Harbor. Lumber schooners came and went on a schedule. None of that is here anymore, and the reason has two halves. The second half is erosion and economics, and we'll get to it. The first half is a deliberate removal of people, and it happened before any of the ranching or the bark trade. This is Sinkyone country. The Sinkyone were an Athabascan-speaking people whose territory covered this coast and the lower South Fork of the Eel River, and who lived in something on the order of 70 villages and seasonal camps across that ground. Salmon runs, tannock acorns, mussels, and surf fish, elk in the prairies on the ridges. To them, this was a productive, well-understood food system, managed with fire and with careful timing across the seasons. Within about 2 decades of the gold rush, that was gone. The violence in this part of California in the 1850s and 60s was organized and, at times, publicly funded, with bounties paid for the killing of native people, and the historical record of it is grim enough that historians now describe the period in northwestern California as genocide. Introduced disease took many of those who survived the raids. The people who came through it were marched to reservations at Round Valley and Hoopa, well inland, away from this shore. That's the part that makes the phrase "lost coast" slightly dishonest. The emptiness on the map is about 170 years old, and it was manufactured by policy and violence within living memory of the generations that followed. The descendants of those communities never accepted that this was settled. In December of 1986, 10 federally recognized tribes with roots in Sinkyone and neighboring territory formed the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council, which was the first organization of its kind in the country. A consortium of tribes created specifically to get ancestral land back and to care for it. It came out of a fight over old-growth redwoods in a grove near the coast that had gone to court in the mid-'80s. In 1997, the council took ownership of 3,845 acres of that ancestral coast and established what they call the Intertribal Wilderness. In 2022, Save the Redwoods League transferred another 523 acres of redwood forest just to the north into the council's hands. The tribes renamed that parcel Chiledun, which in the Sinkyone language means fish run place, so a stretch of coast that state maps and highway plans treated as blank space has been going back, parcel by parcel, into the ownership of the people who were removed from it. That's a strange kind of quiet. The land is empty of houses and full of history that most visitors walk right past. Keep moving north, and the ground climbs. Sinkyone gives way to the King Range, and the character of the coast changes completely. Ridges come down to the water at close to their full height. The trail stops being a trail and becomes a beach. In the end, the government made the terrain's decision official. In 1970, Congress set aside 65,000 acres of the King Range as a national conservation area, the first of its kind in the country, and in 2006, another 42,585 acres inside it were designated wilderness. Land that had defeated the road builders became, by law, land that would not get one. Then, in the middle of all that, there's a town. Shelter Cove sits on a small shelf of flat ground where the coastline makes a rare westward bulge at a headland called Point Delgada. It is the only place on this entire 80-mile shore where you can drive a normal car to the water. The road in leaves the inland freeway near Redway and climbs over the mountains for about 24 miles. And it is a serious piece of driving, narrow, steep, one lane in places, with a reputation for punishing anyone who tries it in a hurry after dark. The shelf that Shelter Cove sits on is worth understanding because it explains the town and it previews everything that comes later. That flat bench is an old seafloor. It was cut by waves at sea level, then lifted. The entire settlement, its houses, its store, its little airstrip, all of it sits on a wave-cut platform that the earth has raised out of the ocean and set down above the surf. The airstrip runs about 3,400 feet along the top of that bench at an elevation of roughly 70 feet, with both ends finishing near open air. Pilots love it and describe it in the way people describe a thing that is slightly beyond sensible. Now, the part that says the most about this coast. In 1964, a development group out of Los Angeles bought a large block of sheep range at Shelter Cove and announced a resort community. The pitch was enormous for a place with no highway to it, something over 4,000 home sites, an airstrip, hundreds of acres of parks. Crews laid down roughly 40 miles of asphalt across those slopes. Advertisements ran in California and Hawaii newspapers through the 60s, and buyers were flown in on free promotional flights to see their lots. What the buyers weren't told was that a great many of those lots could never hold a building. The ground was too steep and too unstable. Cutting terraces and paving roads across slopes like these gave winter rain a set of channels to work with, and the slopes answered. Dozens of lots were physically washed away. Hundreds more were pulled from the offering. People across the country ended up holding deeds to land they could look at and never build on. And some of those deeds are still being traded today. Shelter Cove now is a real community. A few hundred people. A general store, fishing boats launched off a ramp straight into the surf because there's no protected harbor. Deer wandering across the fairways of a 9-hole golf course laid out on that same bench. It works. But it works the way a station in a remote place works. By accepting that the mountain is behind you, the ocean is in front of you, and the road out is long and can close. North of Shelter Cove, the pavement ends for good, and the only route is the beach itself. This is where the Lost Coast Trail's northern section runs. About 25 miles from Black Sands Beach up to the mouth of the Mattole River. Calling it a trail overstates it. For long stretches, there is no path, just cobbles and black sand between the surf and a wall of rising ground. And there are several sections where, at high tide, the ocean comes all the way to the cliff, and there is no way forward and no way back. Hikers there carry a tide table the way they carry water, and the standard advice is to move through those stretches only on a falling tide of 3 feet or less. People who ignore that get pinned. Some have needed rescue. That still strikes me as remarkable. On the most developed coastline in the country, in the most populous state in the Union, there is a public trail whose schedule is set by the moon. About 11 miles up that beach, on a low grassy bench above the surf, there's a small square concrete tower with an iron balcony and no light in it. The Punta Gorda Light Station went into service in January of 1912. It exists because ships kept dying here. Between 1899 and 1907, at least 8 vessels were lost in these waters, and the wreck that finally forced the government's hand happened on the 21st of July, 1907, when the passenger liner Columbia was struck in fog by the steam schooner San Pedro off this coast. Roughly 87 people died. Congress appropriated $60,000 for a light at Punta Gorda, and the final cost came in a few $100s under that figure. There's a blunter reminder of why the light was needed a short way down the same beach. The steam schooner St. Paul went ashore near here in 1905, and its boilers are still out there in the surf, rusting in place, exposed and covered again, depending on how the sand has moved that season. A wreck that has been sitting on a California beach for well over a century without anyone hauling it off tells you something about how hard this shore is to reach. Then, they had to build the station, which meant landing construction material on an open beach with no harbor, in one of the wettest and roughest corners of the coast. Materials came ashore in 1910. The fog signals started running in the summer of 1911, the light itself the following January. Keepers hated it. The station picked up a nickname among lighthouse service personnel as the Alcatraz of lighthouses, a place you got sent when someone wanted you out of the way. Access was by horseback at first, and later by a rough road that washed out with dreary regularity. Supplies came by sea onto a beach that regularly refused to allow a landing. Families lived out there in a cluster of wooden dwellings with a barn, in fog and wind and rain, and the light did its job for 39 years. In May of 1951, the Coast Guard shut it down. Radar and radio navigation had made an isolated coastal light less essential, and this particular light was expensive and miserable to supply. Control of the site passed to the Bureau of Land Management. In 1970, that agency burned the wooden buildings down, in part to stop people from squatting in them. The concrete tower and a small oil house survived because concrete doesn't burn. Both were stabilized and restored a few years ago. That sequence adds up to a pattern. This coast defeated a road, and before that it defeated a lighthouse, which is a far smaller thing to maintain. Every attempt to fix permanent infrastructure onto this shore has eventually lost to the cost of getting anything to it and keeping it there. Push north from the light, and the mountains fall back a little, and the beach widens, and you arrive at a river mouth where the water goes out through a shifting bar of gravel that changes shape between visits. This is the Mattel. It drains about 300 square miles of the King Range and the ridges behind it, and it is one of the most rapidly eroding watersheds in North America. Sediment studies prepared for the Environmental Protection Agency estimated total sediment delivery for the basin at something like 8,000 tons per square mile per year, which is well above the figure estimated for nearby Redwood Creek. Roughly a third of that load was attributed to natural processes and the rest to human activity, mainly logging and roads on unstable slopes. 2 winters set the pattern. On the 22nd of December, 1955, and again on the 22nd of December, 1964, almost exactly 9 years apart, the Mattole ran at peak flows on the order of 90,000 and 78,000 cubic feet per second. For a river of that size, those are astonishing numbers. Hillsides that had been cut over came down into the channel. Deep pools that salmon depended on filled with gravel. The river came out of it wider, shallower, and warmer, and the salmon and steelhead runs have been fighting that ever since, with local watershed groups spending decades now putting wood and shade back into the system. And here is where the human story on this coast bends again. Up the valley, 3 miles or so east of the settlement of Petrolia, sits one of the odder footnotes in American energy history. In 1865, the Union Mattole Oil Company drilled wells on the North Fork of this river and shipped crude to a San Francisco refinery. Those are recognized as California's first drilled oil wells to produce commercially refined oil. A state historical landmark marks the spot, and the town's name comes from exactly that. The first well produced something like 30 barrels of good quality oil before dropping to about a barrel a day, and the venture was abandoned. California went on to become an oil giant somewhere else entirely. This valley kept its name and its cattle and its rain. Population here has been sliding for a long time, and the collapse in the 1930s, after the last of the local resource booms faded, is the moment most often credited with the name that stuck to this whole shoreline. The coast wasn't lost, it was left, by an economy that found easier ground elsewhere, and by a highway department that agreed. Then came the 25th of April, 1992, at 6 minutes past 11 in the morning. An earthquake of magnitude 7.2 broke about 3 miles east of Petrolia, at a depth of roughly 8 miles. On its own, that would have been a major California earthquake. What made it extraordinary came the next day, when 2 aftershocks in the magnitude 6.5 range hit within about 4 hours of each other, in the small hours of the 26th. For a region with a few thousand people in it, the damage was heavy. In Petrolia, 5 homes were destroyed and dozens more badly damaged, and the post office, the gas station, and the general store burned. In Ferndale, that dairy town with the Victorian storefronts, 36 homes were seriously damaged and 20 were knocked clean off their foundations, with something like 80% of the businesses in town damaged. In Scotia, a shopping center burned after the first big aftershock. In Rio Dell, 12 homes were destroyed and the water system was contaminated. Across the region, more than 1,100 structures were damaged or destroyed. 356 people were injured, and the total came to around $61 million. A small tsunami was recorded at Crescent City and in Humboldt Bay. The thing that made this earthquake important to science showed up somewhere else entirely. Out on the beach, along the shore between Cape Mendocino and Punta Gorda, the rocks in the intertidal zone came up out of the water. Not slowly. In the shaking. Mussels, barnacles, sea urchins, coralline algae, all the tightly zoned life that grows in precise bands according to how long it spends submerged, was suddenly sitting above the tide line that had sustained it, and it died in a band you could see from a distance, a pale stripe running along the rocks. Researchers realized they had a measuring instrument. They surveyed the vertical extent of mortality across 14 different attached intertidal species along the rocky shore, and used the top and bottom of those dead bands to calculate exactly how much the land had risen. The answer, published in the journal Geology in 1994, was a maximum of about 1.4 meters, roughly 4.5 feet, give or take a little. The uplift formed a broad, flat-topped arch about 15 miles long, with a gentle slope on its southern side and a steeper one on its north. 4.5 feet of coastline in one morning. That measurement mattered far beyond this shore. Analysis of the main shock published in the journal Science indicated that it had broken on a shallow thrust fault at the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone, which made it a rare, directly observed example of the kind of movement that fault system produces. For a long time, the southern end of Cascadia had been argued about from indirect evidence. A stripe of dead barnacles gave researchers a physical ruler laid across the problem. I find that number harder to absorb than the damage totals. A dairy farmer near Cape Mendocino woke up on the 25th of April with a certain amount of beach in front of the property, and went to bed with a strip of former seafloor added to it permanently. Tide pools that had been underwater for centuries were dry ground by lunchtime. The shoreline in that stretch simply moved. So what is doing this? Off Cape Mendocino, out past the surf, there's a point in the ocean where 3 of the planet's tectonic plates meet. That's the Mendocino Triple Junction, and it's the reason for every strange thing on this coast. South of that point, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate slide past each other. That boundary is the San Andreas Fault, and it runs up the California coast and heads out to sea near Shelter Cove, which is why the flat bench that town sits on is bordered by strands of the San Andreas system. North of that point, the arrangement is completely different. There, a small plate called the Gorda Plate, a fragment of ocean floor, is being pushed underneath North America. That's the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone, the fault system that runs from here up past Oregon and Washington into British Columbia. The Gorda Plate is diving under the continent at a rate on the order of an inch or so a year, and at the same time it's being squeezed against the Pacific Plate from the south at roughly twice that rate. So this one stretch of coast is where a sliding boundary, a subducting boundary, and a fracture zone all terminate against each other. 3 plates, 3 different kinds of motion converging on a corner. The whole geometry migrates slowly northward over geologic time, which means the King Range has been sitting in the most intensely squeezed position on the west coast for the last several 100,000 years. The consequences show up in the earthquake catalog. County hazard planning documents for Humboldt describe the Triple Junction area as the most seismically active region in California and estimate an average of about 80 earthquakes of magnitude 3 or greater every year in the vicinity. Over the past half-century, this corner of the North Coast has accounted for something like a quarter of all the seismic energy released in the state, in a place with a fraction of a percent of its people. Nothing about that has settled down. In December of 2024, a magnitude 7 earthquake struck offshore of Cape Mendocino. A tsunami warning went out along hundreds of miles of coastline before being canceled within the hour, and dozens of aftershocks followed, including one right at Petrolia. Squeezing 3 plates into one corner has to go somewhere, and where it goes is up. The rock of the King Range has been driven skyward along a thrust fault, and estimates put the total uplift of that block in the range of 2 to 3 miles of rock raised, at long-term rates of a few millimeters a year. That's why a 4,000-foot mountain stands 3 miles from the surf with nothing in between. It's also why no engineer could find a stable line for a highway through it. The entire block is being lifted, fractured, and shaken while rain and swell tear at the bottom of it, and the debris comes off it faster than almost anywhere on the continent, which finally explains the tsunami maps. A coastline sitting on the end of a subduction zone is a coastline exposed to the specific hazard that subduction zones produce. The Cascadia Fault last ruptured along its full length on the 26th of January, 1700, in an earthquake now estimated in the range of magnitude 9, and the tsunami it sent across the Pacific was recorded in Japanese records that same winter, which is how the date is known so precisely. Modeling for a repeat puts surges of tens of feet on the outer Humboldt coast, arriving in minutes rather than hours, because the fault sits directly offshore. Communities up here run tsunami drills that assume there will be no official warning, only the shaking itself as the signal to move uphill. That's the whole system, and it's the answer the map was hiding. Everyone assumes this shore stayed blank because it was scenic and inconvenient, and nobody got around to it. What's actually out here is a tectonic corner sitting in the middle of a rich, crowded state, where the ground rises and shakes fast enough to outrun anyone trying to build on it. There's one last piece of evidence, and it's the one I'd want anyone to carry out of here because it's visible from the beach, and it turns the whole coastline into a record. Above the surf in this region, in places where the slope allows it, the land goes up in steps. A flat bench, then a rise, then another flat bench higher up, then another. From the right angle, they look like enormous, shallow stairs cut into the hillside, softened by grass and brush. Each of those benches is an old shoreline. The mechanism is simple once you see it. Waves grind a flat platform at sea level, the way they're grinding one right now at the base of these cliffs. Then the land lifts. That platform is carried up out of reach of the waves, and the ocean starts cutting a new one below it. Ice ages help, because sea level itself rises and falls by hundreds of feet as ice sheets grow and melt, so the cutting happens in pulses. Do that repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years on ground that keeps rising, and you get a staircase of dead beaches climbing away from the water. Geologists have used those steps as a speedometer. By dating the terraces and measuring how high they've been carried, they can read the local uplift rate directly off the landscape, and the numbers vary in a way that maps the Triple Junction beautifully. Averaged over roughly the last 70,000 years, uplift runs at something like 4 millimeters a year near Big Flat, in the heart of the King Range, and around 2.8 millimeters a year near Cape Mendocino. Move south to Shelter Cove and it drops to about 1 millimeter a year. Keep going south to Fort Bragg, well away from the junction, and it falls to roughly 1/3 of a millimeter a year, more than 10 times slower than the King Range. The closer you get to the corner where the plates meet, the faster the land climbs out of the sea. And along the Mattole and Assan and the Cape Mendocino shore, researchers have found low terraces so young they belong to human history. Surveying and dating of raised shorelines less than 8,000 years old show at least 4 separate episodes of sudden emergence between roughly 7,000 and 600 years ago. And the pattern of those old uplifts closely matches the pattern measured after 1992, which means the dead mussel line on those rocks in April of that year was one more step in a staircase that has been under construction for as long as anyone has lived here, and for a very long time before that. Stand on one of those low benches on a gray afternoon at the north end of this coast, with the wind coming straight in off the water and the surf working the cobbles below, and you're standing on sea floor. Real sea floor, cut flat by waves, once populated by the same intertidal life clinging to the rocks a few dozen feet below and a few thousand years younger. Above you, another bench. Above that, another. The oldest ones up on the shoulders of the ridge, tilted and gullied and half erased, carrying soil and grass and elk trails. The Sinkyone lived on those benches because flat ground is scarce here, and the terraces are where the flat ground is. The ranchers who came after built their houses on them. The lighthouse sat on one. Shelter Cove's runway is laid out on one. Every human thing that has ever managed to hold on along this shoreline has done it on a piece of ground the ocean made, and the earthquakes lifted. And the ocean is cutting the next one right now at the waterline, in the dark, at a pace of a few millimeters a year, waiting for the next hard shake to raise it into the light. If a stretch of coastline like this one has a way of resetting your sense of how solid the ground is, I'd rather it did that here than anywhere else. So if this changed the picture you had of the West Coast, drop a like on it and subscribe if you want more places pulled apart this way. And I'd honestly like to hear one thing in the comments. Is there a blank spot on the map near you? A stretch of road that stops? A place everybody drives around instead of through? Tell me where it is and what people say about it. Half the time, that silence has a mechanism underneath it.